Hey there, and welcome to part two of our discussion of Batman: The Dark Knight. And before we get into the more specifics of the story of Batman, I thought I'd also point out that in addition to the connection to masks, which, as I said in the other little lecture, that is something that goes across different cultures and different time periods, which is kind of the theme of this course. But Batman also is uh, partly derived from this tradition called Gothic literature, which is I like to call sort of a pleasing sort of terror, uh, and the kind of darkness and terror that we like to be engaged with to get a bit of a thrill, to get some excitement. This is why we watch horror movies and thriller movies and suspense films, and dark anti-hero kind of films and books such as Batman. Um, but this kind of tradition, although you might argue that it's always kind of been around, we've always wanted to be scared and terrified. This particular style or version of Gothic literature comes from the sort of mid 18th century, around 1764, with the publication of this novel called The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. And in this story, we get sort of some of the typical elements of a Gothic story, which usually is very melodramatic, so sort of over the top. It features a spooky castle or manor, and has some subterranean passages and tunnels, and some mystery, and the tone and feel is dark and somber and gloomy and gray, and has a certain kind of architecture that's from that era, and that's why you'll see in Gothic stories, you'll see that kind of Baroque architecture, or Gothic architecture, I should say, that often features things like gargoyles, and you'll see that in Batman as well. And this tradition continued with the writer Edgar Allan Poe, who was in the 19th century, in the mid 1800s, wrote a story called The Fall of the House of Usher, in addition to a number of other stories and poems that were you could consider to be Gothic. And so Edgar Allan Poe, he focused a little bit less on the traditional elements of Gothic stories and more on the psychology. So it was more of a Gothic psychology. So even though a story like The Fall of the House of Usher would have had a spooky haunted house, what was that was more symbolic of the madness or inner darkness of the characters. Um, so so this is something that I think carries on into Batman, both senses of the tradition, because Batman features the visible style of Gothic literature, in the sense that it's dark and gloomy, and Gotham City. It's called Gotham City because it's Gothic. Often features gargoyles in the architecture, and again, is very dark and gloomy, and is a city that is much like the architecture in the Gothic literature stories, is in decay. So things falling apart, things rotting and corrupting, and descending into madness and chaos. So the sense of madness is seen both in Batman himself, who struggles with his own sort of mental health issues, right? The trauma of losing his parents, and the encounter with the Bat, and so on. But also the madness of the whole city. This is why Arkham Asylum is such an important feature of the Batman universe, and the Batman video games, if you've played those recently, and the Joker himself, who's of course a mad character. So, and this speaks to the kind of things that we as humans are afraid of. This is why we're attracted to these kind of end of the world or falling apart kind of stories, because it's what we're most afraid of: civilization falling apart. So that's why we like things like Batman, and also other shows like The Walking Dead, which is kind of an apocalyptic story, in the sense of what happens if there's some kind of event, whether it's nuclear holocaust or a zombie apocalypse, that leads to the end of the world as we know it. And the few humans that are left, the few sane and rational humans that are left, have to survive and figure out how to cope. So this is what we're always afraid of, I think, because it's a very slippery slope and a very thin veneer of civilization that can very easily be destroyed. So so that's this is kind of the tradition that Batman's coming from. Other examples, of course, besides Edgar Allan Poe, are Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Bram Stoker's Dracula. So this is this is the tradition that Batman's coming from. Some of the main themes that we'll see in Batman are sharp contrasts between different things. So light versus dark, so good versus evil, right? That very sharp contrast. So we see that in the heroes and the villains, of course, but even though that's a very sharp contrast, particularly with someone like Two-Face, who is quite literally both good and evil, or dark and light, human and monster, right? All in one person. He kind of represents what is going on with a lot of the characters internally. Two-Face wears it on his face quite literally, externally, but Batman and a lot of the other characters have this battle inside them, right? The light versus the dark, and the good versus the evil. So it's kind of gray in that sense. There's also order versus chaos, and of course, Batman kind of represents order, and certainly Commissioner Gordon does, and the law. And the Joker represents chaos. In fact, he calls himself an agent of chaos. That's what he says in the more recent film with Heath Ledger as the Joker, when he's talking to Two-Face. He says, "Introduce a little anarchy. I'm an agent of chaos." And he makes an interesting point. The fact that as humans, we like order, even if the plan is horrible. So nobody gets upset. He says nobody gets upset if things go according to plan, even if the plan is horrible, right? We're all schemers trying to control our little worlds, right? So he kind of makes a good point in the sense that the universe is probably a little bit more chaotic and disorderly than we would like. So we have these, we try to control it and have these plans and order it, even if the plan is itself terrible. It's just, all you have to do is just think of Hitler and World War II Germany. It was very orderly and quite according to plan, the way they exterminated the Jews by putting them in concentration camps and gas ovens and so on, killing millions and millions and millions of them during the Holocaust. So that was a plan that more or less went according to schedule and was very orderly, but terribly evil and horrible, right? So he makes an interesting point that chaos is not always a bad thing, and order is not always a good thing. So this is what Batman is often doing, is playing around with notions of what's good and what's bad, and how there's often somewhere in between that most of us kind of live in that in-between zone. And Batman himself is, even though he is on the good side, he's doesn't always follow the rules. In fact, he breaks the rules all the time. He doesn't really follow the law. That's why he's a vigilante, right? He's kind of an anti-hero. His ends kind of, to him, justify the means, right? So he has good intentions, and the outcomes are usually good and positive. But along the way, he breaks all sorts of rules to get there. So Batman is kind of an agent of chaos and order, if you look at it in the right way. And he does have certain rules, one of them being he won't kill anybody. And of course, the Joker tries to exploit that rule as often as he can, even trying to get Batman to kill him. So trying to upset even Batman's sense of order. And so definitely an interesting what we call a dichotomy that is problematic throughout the whole Batman universe and series. And of course, there's the idea that Batman and the Joker are very closely related. That one is kind of the other side of the other one, right? So they're kind of two different sides of the same coin, which especially in the Dark Knight film, is an appropriate way to look at it, because Two-Face is kind of showing that by having that coin that he keeps flipping that shows heads or tails. So really, Batman and the Joker are kind of like on the same coin. It's just they're on different sides. At least that's what's kind of suggested. And in some ways, if we look at the hero embodying the culture, which, as I said, that's kind of like what happens in those epic poems of like the Odyssey, where Odysseus represents the values of that culture at that time. Batman kind of represents what we value as a culture right now, which is kind of recognizing that, we're kind of in between. We'd all like to be heroes, but sometimes there's things that we need to do that are not heroic, but that get the job done, more or less, and that we all struggle with good and evil. That within each person, there's a potential Batman and a potential Joker. So the other thing that's important is the idea of making a choice. Actually, before I go into that, one last thing I wanted to point out. I've showed you the image here of the chess pieces. The reason being that in the story in the film, Two-Face, before he becomes Two-Face, he's this lawyer called Harvey Dent, who's basically trying to fight crime through the law and through the court system, and try to clean up Gotham City that way. And so he's often painted as the White Knight, and which I think is, of course, interesting, because Batman is portrayed as the Dark Knight, right? So there's Batman's a little bit more of a chaotic approach to fighting crime, a little bit more on the dark terror side. Harvey Dent, more the kind of conventional, orderly way of dealing with crime. And of course, all of that is turned on its head and interrupted by the activities of the Joker, right? Who influences both the actions of Batman and Two-Face. And as you can see, this really cool picture of him playing with the chess pieces. So anyway, I just wanted to point that little interesting tidbit out. So yeah, it's about the choices that the characters make, and the Joker tries to manipulate Batman into making difficult choices. Who to save, like in the film, whether to save Harvey Dent, the hero of Gotham City, or his love interest, Rachel Dawes. Difficult choice. How do you choose? So he tries to force him into making that. And also forcing him to choose to kill somebody. And this is sort of echoed in the choice that he presents to the this is again the film, the people that are on the boats. There's a boat full of criminals and a boat full of just regular people, and each has an explosive device, and the detonator is on the other boat. So the criminals can choose to blow up the regular people and vice versa. So it kind of puts each group in a difficult situation, which, I don't have to explain the moral implications of that. Save yourself, or, for instance, kill the criminals who, in your mind may deserve to die more than you do. The other way to play it is to not play the game and not make the choice, which is, I think, is what happens in the film. And of course, Batman makes difficult choices, but also finds ways around it to not play Joker's game. So keep that in mind in just your regular life, in your own day-to-day living, that you always can make choices, and sometimes the choices you can make, even if you're presumably forced into something, you can always make an alternative choice and choose not to play the game that's being presented to you. For instance, going back to the Holocaust survivors would say that they would be forced to do things, and they would have no choice. Their choice would be taken away. But what no one could ever take away from them was their own personal response to their situation, their internal response. So you can make me say things, you can make me do things, but inside I will always have my own choice about how I'm responding to things. And that's what helped people survive. So keep that in mind. This is just some real world stuff for you. So anyway, so it's about these choices that are made on a heroic level, but also on a day-to-day personal level, on the fact on the level of the just you and me, the regular people. And this again suggests to me that this is perhaps why we need Batman, because we need sometimes someone to make those choices for us, or to provide the large scale template for us to follow or to emulate. So this is our good friend Joseph Campbell, who is the one who we've talked about as the one who created that pattern, or pointed out the pattern of the hero's journey, or the monomyth, and its multiple stages. And this is a quote from his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And here he's talking about the difference between dream and myth. So dream is the personalized myth. Myth is the depersonalized dream. Both myth and dream are symbolic in the same general way of the dynamic of the psyche. But in the dream, the forms are quirked by the peculiar troubles of the dreamer, whereas in myth, the problems and solutions sown are directly valid for all mankind. So this kind of tells us a little bit about why we need our heroes, right? Or our mythology, why we might need someone like Batman. Because even though Batman or Bruce Wayne, the actual individual hero, is haunted by his own dreams, just the way we are, each of us, haunted by our own dreams that sometimes have mythological things in them. The mythological story of someone like Odysseus or Batman is useful to us because it becomes directly valid for all of humanity. So it's a symbol that all of us can use in a way that if you tell someone about the dream you had last night, that's not necessarily going to be useful to somebody else because it's so personal to you. So again, this is why heroes often embody the values or the problems of the civilization or the culture or the time that they come from. So that's a good little tidbit from our good friend Joseph Campbell. And speaking of Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, I want to just look broadly at the graphic novel I've asked you to read, which is The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller. And I'd like to suggest that the 4 parts, because the graphic novel is actually composed of what were originally issued as 4 separate comic books. They've just been compiled in one place. The overall arc of the whole journey of all 4 parts or comic books in the graphic novel follow the hero's journey pretty closely. So in The Dark Knight Returns, Bruce Wayne feels the call to adventure. He's been retired for about 10 years, I believe it is. And, there's a new threat of these mutants on the street. And they're causing all sorts of mayhem. And he even gets into an encounter with one of them. And so there's a need for Batman once more, because things have fallen apart in his absence. But he resists this because he's been struggling with his own inner demons. Jason Todd, who was his Robin, has died. Which has caused him a lot of pain and a lot of angst about his role as Batman. And also, he's just older, right? He's 55, I believe, and so he's late middle-aged guy that's not as young and as fit as he used to be. And so naturally, he would resist coming out of retirement. But so that's the refusal of the call. But he does. He comes out. And so he crosses that threshold, which I would suggest is possibly going into the Batcave. Again, that's a stage that has a number of entry points. It could be him going into the Batcave. It could be the moment where in the graphic novel where the bat, he's haunted by this vision of a bat who crashes through the window, and that's sort of crossing the threshold back into being Batman more internally. And the belly of the whale is perhaps when he goes into the Batcave, which is kind of like an underground internal thing which you might think of as kind of like the belly of a whale, both in just its physical nature and also the fact that at this point, once he goes into the Bat Cave and puts on the Bat costume, there's no going back. It's the point of no return. And so in the second book, this The Dark Knight Triumphant, which is the second part of the graphic novel, he also he defeats Two-Face. Sorry, that might be in the first one. Anyway, I'm fuzzy on that, but he goes through a series of trials and adventures, right? And he defeats Two-Face. Actually, I think that's the end of Dark Knight Returns, and at the end of Dark Knight Triumphant, he loses round one, but then eventually defeats the mutant leader. So he's going through a series of adventures and trials, right? And in Hunt the Dark Knight, the third part, he defeats the Joker. So the trials are continuing, and the Joker kind of being, his arch nemesis. This is him. I'm not sure you might want to call this atonement with the father, but certainly he has moments. He's dealing with the death of his parents, right? And I think you might want to look for a scene where he's coming to grips with the death of his parents at some point, because I think he does have a lot of flashbacks still. And but anyway, defeats the Joker. That's again part of the trials. He actually has a scene of magic flight or rescue when Robin rescues him in the helicopter. And moving forward to the last and final book, there's definitely a series of rebirth for both Batman and Superman, who's also a major character in the graphic novel. And at the end, he's also the master of two worlds, because he's presumed to be dead, Batman, but he's only been faking the death so that the symbol or the idea of Batman can kind of die, at least for the time being. But the real hero can continue underground. So in that way, he's kind of the master of two worlds. And that's the last scene where we see Batman once again alive. So he's kind of mastered life and death, but also above ground and underground. And he's about to continue the adventures, but now with the mutants on his side. He's training them to be the next generation. So, and again, the idea of crossing the threshold back and forth, there's the ordinary world, which is that of Bruce Wayne, and that of the special world, which is the Batcave and everything to do with Batman. So that's Batman's journey, and I think you can see how that lines up with the hero's journey. So we'll keep coming back to that as we go through. Also wanted to point out the different representations of Batman throughout the last 70 years or so. This was my understanding of Batman when I was a kid. There's a TV series, which some of you may be familiar with, from the 1960s, starring Adam West as Batman and Burt Ward as Robin. And this was a kind of a silly and campy version of Batman. It was deliberately ridiculous and over the top and kind of silly and theatrical and goofy. And it was aware that it was being all of those things, right? So it was kind of like, yeah, I know we're being cheesy, but, that's part of the fun. So quite a different version of Batman than the one we're used to recently. And as I said, I think that Batman or heroes represent the values of the culture of the time. And that's also kind of seen in the evolution of Batman. Batman came about in around the time of World War II, when we needed heroes to fight crime and fight the enemies that were threatening our real world. Especially that's where characters like Captain America also came about, who were literally coming out of the World War II mythology. So Batman in the 60s, was a time of kind of being young. It was all like the hippie movement and flower power and that whole music movement. And a lot of the aesthetics and culture at the time were kind of colorful and often silly and ridiculous and lighthearted. and not dark at all. So I mean, that's kind of where Batman was. It was appropriate for the culture at the time. Not that 1960s didn't have its own kind of difficulties and darkness, but certainly it was a different feel to the world then. And Batman is still, or Adam West is still alive and kicking, and you've probably seen him on The Simpsons, and also, oh crap, what's the Seth MacFarlane series? I can't remember it. You know the one with Stewie. Okay, if I remember it, it'll come back to me. But he plays the mayor in that scene or in that TV show. So he's still kicking and still going. There's actually a great documentary about him on Netflix if you're interested. And just for fun, you definitely should Google the Bat Watusi, which is a very silly dance that Batman did in one of the shows. So anyway, enough of that particular Batman. But also not just in filmic and TV representations, but also in the comic book itself. I've given you this link to this graphic that shows the 70 years of Batman's evolution as he's moved from the 40s, and actually I guess it was 1939 when he was created, all the way up to our present day. And as you can see, Batman has become more and more and more serious and dark and sinister as he's moved away from a more kind of childlike and cartoony and sometimes silly kind of costume and appearance. And I'll leave you to read the descriptions below. Like I said, I posted a link to it in the content section of our Batman folder. But also the Joker. The Joker has also changed from his portrayal by Cesar Romero in 1966 from that Batman series I was talking about. Very clownish and very silly and very over the top, and in some ways not really that scary or not even really that threatening. Then we get to the Tim Burton version from 1989, which had Jack Nicholson as the Joker, which was a much, much darker and much more sinister portrayal. And Tim Burton, this was 1989, so he was borrowing from the graphic novel that we're studying, which is again considering Batman in a much more darker sense than we'd seen him previously. So moving away from his more simplistic and cartoonish origins, and elevating him to a darker and perhaps more mythic proportion. So reflected kind of the darkness of our times. The 80s, of course, was full of its own kind of trauma, especially with the Cold War between the Reagan United States and the USSR, which I think is referred to a little bit in our graphic novel. So times were dark and under threat of a nuclear holocaust because of this this Cold War. And, so humanity wasn't looking too stable or too good. So naturally we need a darker villain and a darker Batman to match. Then we get to 2008, and since then we've had 9/11. So the world has become not only darker, but also more terrorized and more chaotic, and more prone to seemingly mad and random acts of violence. So naturally, our Joker needs to represent an even crazier, unhinged, or chaotic portrayal, which, of course, we get a brilliant one by Heath Ledger. And so even the mask and the makeup is kind of a little bit more messy and random and chaotic. So interesting to look at the different portrayals of Batman over the years. So now I'd like to take a look at the actual graphic novel itself and walk you through some of what I found to be the important images and scenes from the graphic novel. The first few you may have already seen by looking at these slides, because I've attached the text to go with it. But I'll just recap here as well. And graphic novels are important as a medium because, and comic books as well, because we have not just text and like a written story, the way we've had with novels and short stories and poems and so on, but we also have the visuals. So the visuals often being just as important, if not more important, than the words that we see. However, we also get kind of an interesting hybrid between somewhere between text and film, because with the written part of it, we often get to see inside the characters' heads, right? The way we would in a novel or a story. Whereas in a film, we can't get away with that, but it still works in a comic book or a graphic novel. And the images also, as compared to a film, are also stills, right? So you can, and also compared to a live action film, there's a lot more you can do with a comic book visuals, obviously, than you can in a live action film, though we've come a long way with CGI. So certainly animation is a much closer connection to graphic novels in the comic book medium than a live action film. And that's why it's interesting to look at the adaptation, the animated adaptation of The Dark Knight Returns, which is an animated film, and is quite close to the graphic novel because it can be. So interesting to look at that, and that may be one of the ones that you look at instead of The Dark Knight. Also, lastly, a still has a different effect than an animated image. So there's something about the composition of a still frame that is essentially different than one that is moving. So the moving image being more important, obviously, in a film than a graphic novel or comic book. So anyway, we'll get to more of that as we go along. So Bruce Wayne in this particular scene, this is him as he's sort of brooding and contemplating. He's retired, and he even looks quite different with his mustache, and definitely, as you can see, he's older, right? He looks his age in this picture, and the visuals in the scene and throughout a lot of the graphic novel. You notice the colors that they've chosen are very muted, very a lot of grays and pale blues and grayish blues and light browns. So it kind of suggests that the life and the vitality has left Gotham City, that it's in decay, and you can see in the background as well that some of the buildings look like they're old and falling apart a little bit, our focus, of course, is on Batman or Bruce Wayne himself as he's walking through the streets. But if we pay attention, either directly or subconsciously, to what's going on in the scene around him, there's the doomsayers, right, that you'll often see in large cities that are sort of saying the end of the world is coming, the end of the world is coming. You normally dismiss them as crackpots, but here there's something sinister and foreboding about it. With the signs, we are damned, we are doomed, right? And the people holding the signs also look kind of decrepit and also like they're decaying and falling apart, or almost zombie-like, right? So there's a lot in one frame to a lot of information, visual information that supports the feel and the tone and what's happening in the story. This kind of scene is also reminiscent of a film style called film noir, which is a genre film that usually done in black and white, usually involving some kind of hero, crime-fighting detective who broods and walks along lonely streets and has these internal monologues, and are usually very dark, darkly themed, and they usually have a femme fatale, and so Batman is very much kind of in that style. And so as he's walking along, the city looks like it's falling apart. He's kind of given up on the city, much as the city's given up on itself. and we get the sense that he's almost like himself a dead man. And that's what the text says. I'm a zombie. I'm a Flying Dutchman, a dead man. So he's like literally The Walking Dead, right? There's a good zombie reference. And one last thing about the film noir. Usually in film noir, there is the technique of using a voiceover where we actually hear the internal monologue of the character, which works in a film noir setting, also can work in a comic book setting. Doesn't often work in a film setting because it comes across as being too cheesy nowadays. But still, it's still used and can kind of be acceptable in certain formats, and I think this is one. So anyway, let's carry on. So in this scene, a whole lot of interesting things happening. You see Bruce Wayne on the left panel there, under the street lamp, and there's something about that, the contrast of the dark and the light, right? That shows kind of the surrounding darkness of the city and perhaps Bruce Wayne's soul. The fact that it's a solitary street lamp, so he looks very alone. And you can see all around him the litter and the broken down fences and the sort of like maybe perhaps an abandoned car in the background. So it kind of supports what he's thinking about, which is that Gotham City is older and it's dirtier, and the past is not too far away. Right, the past is very much in the present. Because he's reflecting on the fact that his parents were killed many, many years ago in much a similar scene. So in some ways, some things have never changed. In some ways, there's always a need for someone like him, for someone like Batman. And so here he also has an encounter with a bunch of these petty criminals who are this new kind of criminal called the mutants, who have a disturbing looking, not quite human looking body and features, and have these sort of, red visors, and which look kind of evil and menacing, which again is a mask. And this scene is also kind of reminiscent again of the past, of the fact that his parents were killed by a petty crime mugger in much the same way. So then, a few panels later, he realizes that the man who killed his parents, he did a terrible thing, but at least he had an appropriate response to what he had done. He was guilty. He was shocked about it. He really only wanted the money. The murder was kind of an accident. Not an accident, but not an intentional or premeditated thing. But what's different now is that these mutants, these slice and dice characters, they're in it for violence sake. They're not there for the money, or just to survive. They're doing it for fun. They're doing it for the sport of it. So this is kind of reminiscent of the film Clockwork Orange, if you've ever seen that film. Malcolm McDowell and his gang are kind of like these young, basically young punks who just have no sense of morality at all, and are just it's not just that they do bad things, it's just that they do them just for the sake of doing them. They don't even have any concept that they're bad or evil. So kind of reflects the change in times as well, between criminals from say 50, 60 years ago, and sort of criminals today who might be more sociopathic or psychopathic. And you can only just look at any of the recent shootings, including the one that happened in the Batman release of one of these Batman films in Colorado. So anyway, lastly, I want you to notice also how he talks about Batman as a separate person, and refers to himself and Batman as we, which kind of suggests kind of this duality of Bruce Wayne's nature, right? So within the one body or the one person, there's really two beings or two potentials. So anyway, that's that frame. Also an important scene. This is Bruce Wayne. He's listening to messages that he's received from Two-Face, who is presumably reformed, also from Superman and Catwoman, and of course they're leaving messages under their real names, Harvey Clark and Selina. Again, suggesting the duality of all these characters, right? So he's haunted by his past, his own inner darkness, which is presumably more of a dream nightmare kind of bat than an actual one in the scene. And then visually, if you're looking at the scene, you've got the window panes that look like what I'd suggest are like kind of like prison bars. And then it even kind of shifts a little bit to look like an X, right? Like he's being targeted by his past. So you might think that for the last 10 years in his retirement, he's been living in his own kind of internal self-imposed prison, which, is not exactly a fun retirement. So then the bat breaks through. Again, I suggest this is probably more of a dream than an actual bat bursting through the glass. So his dream nightmare is kind of being externalized by this bat and by performing the role of Batman. So he's living out, or maybe perhaps therapeutically dealing with his past and trauma by performing this role. And one of the other things that's a characteristic of film noir, that film tradition I was just talking about, is the contrast between dark and light. The films are typically shot in black and white, and you often see like scenes, such as you'll see in Sin City, where characters are shown with shadows that are sort of crisscrosses of dark and light. So the classic example being a Venetian blind and the shadow that casts, right? That will cast a dark and light bars on a character. So to sort of suggest that, duality of light and dark within a character. And here it's shown with the window panes. So this is a really cool panel. This is kind of a rebirth scene. And this is the first full appearance we see of Batman since he's returned. And unlike all the bleak images before, look how bright and kind of vibrant the colors are here. Strong blues and the yellows, and even the colors in the background are warmer toned. And so this kind of reflects the inner reality of what Bruce Wayne feels. It's like a rebirth. And he says he feels like a man in his 20s, despite the fact that he's, actually 55. And so in the meanwhile, in the side panels, we have the girls who he rescued earlier, one of whom is going to later become his new Robin, trying to describe him. And funny how they both they inflate his actual size and stature to something of mythic proportions. She says he's a man about 12 feet tall, right? So huge. And the perspective here, the visual perspective, also makes him seem massively huge, right? Descending from the sky like an epic monster or hero. So in one page, we see the impact of the Batman symbol on both the man, so the personalized myth, like Joseph Campbell was talking about, and on the culture, which, as we said, is the depersonalized dream. So the difference between dream and myth, and personal and public. So here, also another interesting image. This is the Joker, who's previously been essentially catatonic, in some kind of almost sleep-like state, not himself at all. And also behind, I believe, an asylum, which has those kind of windows that has the crisscross little wires or bars in them. So similar to this is an echo of the scene that we saw just a couple of panels earlier with Batman, with the fact that he's been in a kind of prison, which he's about to emerge from. So just as Batman wakes up, so does the Joker. And I think it's also very interesting the way they show these three panels together, with very, very little change in movement or expression of the Joker. So it shows that very slow and kind of sinister waking up. And I think the stillness, often stillness, is way creepier than over the top gestures and drama. So I think a really interesting visual choice by the artists here. And of course, what wakes him up, he's like, oh, what kind of bombs? Right. So a very interesting series of panels. So a little bit later, we have Batman's confrontation with Two-Face. Harvey Dent has been supposedly reformed, and he's got plastic surgery to fix his ugly half, right? So visually, or on the surface, he appears whole. But what we discover is, as he says, the scars go deep. So internally, he's just as much of a monster as he's always been. So there's this almost like hallucination of Harvey as he is perhaps on the inside, or as he perceives himself to be. And so he's still the same Two-Face that we've always known him to be. And even before the little hallucination of the grotesque Two-Face on panel 3 here, the first two panels show Harvey in semi-darkness, right? So even though his face looks fully healed and human, you can see just visually it's half light and half dark. And then just below the panels, just below it, you notice how there's 4 panels of Harvey on top, 4 panels of Batman below. So Batman is kind of like the other side of Harvey's situation, right? He identifies with the fact that Harvey has these two sides. And that's why he sees, when he looks at Harvey, a reflection of himself. And he's contemplating his own, just as Harvey Dent has this sort of burned, scarred version of himself, Batman also has his scars, which are symbolized by the bat. And we also see Batman's image sort of in semi-darkness. So anyway, yeah, so a really interesting image that kind of, again, blurs the lines between hero and villain, and outer darkness and inner darkness. This is an interesting panel because it shows how the mutants are essentially taking over, and I think it's it's interesting because you see sort of somewhat ordered, like the mutants are kind of ordered the way they're all lined up in the background. Yet, and also notice how the visually the skyline almost matches up with that first row in the background of the soldiers. So as if the city has become that. And then splashed across all of that is the chaotic image of an angry image of the chief mutant bearing a torch. Which suggests sort of the chaos of things burning and falling apart, and the mad mob overthrowing civilization. So it suggests, the coming chaos, and of course he's standing on a junk heap, right? So it's kind of like civilization's, garbage pile, right? What we throw away and what is now going to become the reality, right? The city falling apart. And this reminds me of a really amazing poem by a poet named W.B. Yeats, who is an Irish poet. And he wrote this poem called The Second Coming, which has been often used and quoted in a lot of popular culture references. And he wrote it in response to what for him seemed like the world was falling apart. He was writing about the Irish rebellion against the British, and how chaotic and crazy a time that was. But if you apply that to this story, or even to our current world with things like 9/11 and school shootings and all that happening, it seems to fit. And it's all about this separation of civilization from into madness and chaos. So I'll play it for you. This is a really good, I would read it for you, but this guy does an even better job, so I'll play it for you.
The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, The centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dim tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. A waste of desert sand, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its sloth eyes, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born?
So pretty cool poem, right? So I think it very strongly reflects what's happening here, right? What rough beast is slouching towards Bethlehem to be born? So instead of the second coming of Christ, as we know in the Christian tradition, which is supposed to be a good thing, instead it's the coming of something much darker and much more sinister. And and I think this character, and it's the creature that he calls forth as the image is the Sphinx. But this is just as terrifying an image, this crazy mutant leader. So, the sense of the fact that the worst people and the worst men in these kind of times are full of passionate intensity. And look at the passionate intensity that this guy has. And the best, so the good guys essentially lack all conviction. So the regular police force and the regular politicians, they don't have any conviction to fight these guys. They don't have any strength. So Batman is the antidote. He is the one that can take action against these leaders. So, but he's also not completely good either. So perhaps he's also a beast waiting to be born. So all sorts of different ways to interpret that. So. But certainly this is like where we see that Gotham City belongs to the mutants. So this is, we talked about the belly of the whale. This is Batman going to the dark place, as he says, where I first met you before my parents died, before I learned what I am. So the dark place being that internally dark place, but also the Batcave itself. And this is where he encounters again the symbol of the bat, and something that's deeper and more significant and more powerful than he, the man, is. And notice he says that it glides with ancient grace, so something that's older than he is, something that's deeper than he is. Eyes gleaming, untouched by love or joy or sorrow. Breath not with the taste of fallen foes, the stench of dead things, damned things. Surely the fiercest survivor, the purest warrior, glaring, hating, claiming me as your own. So him being possessed by this bat, this symbol of his darkness, and this all taking place in the Bat Cave. So this is kind of the point of no return, right? This is kind of the belly of the whale, as I was saying before. So again, a very important series of panels. This one I really like because, as you know, he takes on a new Robin, who instead of being a boy is actually a girl, so kind of playing against type, which I think is also pretty forward-thinking for the day. And what you'll notice about this one single panel, I think this is a full one-page panel. This is after... I think he's had a disastrous encounter with the mutant leader. He's really roughed up. I think Robin has saved him and is kind of... she's essentially... she wasn't a superhero before this all began. She was just a fan. She was literally like a fangirl who basically decides she's going to make her own costume and follow him around and basically force him to let her be his Robin. And you can see he's thrilled by that, by the expression on his face, right? But what I think what's interesting visually is look how rigid and stern and upright he is. He almost looks like like a statue, and he's so gray and so pale and also scarred and roughed up. So he's old, right? He's this old kind of now crusty and dark hero, so he's part of the past. So what she represents, and you see in contrast how warm, like she's giving him this big, she's jumping up and giving them this big, huge hug, right? And she's smiling, and just color-wise, she's all brightly colored in the bright yellow and red and green, with the bright orange hair. So she kind of represents in the scene and in this comic the hope for the future, right? She's the young, she's the youth. She is going to be the one, along with later the reformed mutants at the end, the ones who carry forward the hope and idealism part of being a hero and Batman. So I think it's an interesting contrast of images here, which I think only really work as a visual still panel. It would be hard to describe this or even show this filmically without it being super cheesy. This is a very kind of disturbing part of the graphic novel. Now, remember, this was done in 1986, so long time ago, this graphic novel. And what you see here is a scene where, again, this is kind of representing the chaos of the times. It's a scene where a very mentally ill and disturbed man goes into a theater and essentially opens fire on the entire audience. And you can read the scene again for yourself. And then the news report where it's reported that 3 were slain in a Batman-inspired shootout in a theater. In this case, a porn theater, but it was inspired by Batman, right? So I don't know if you remember, there was a real-world incident in which one of the Batman films was released, and I believe it was the more recent Batman, the one with Bane, but there was a shooting. And basically, it's the same kind of situation. It even looks like this guy went into a theater, mentally ill, thought he was something kind of like the Joker. Maybe he was even inspired by this very scene from the graphic novel, and opened fire on the audience and killed several people. Very tragic. So I think it's just kind of disturbing a little bit how that particular real life incident was kind of reflected or perhaps predicted here in the earlier graphic novel from some 20 years before. So anyway, just kind of a scary parallel correlation, and again the kind of sometimes disturbing crossover between art and life and fiction and reality, which is something that's also being played with. Speaking of fiction and reality, there's my desktop. We just stepped out of the fiction of this PowerPoint presentation. Anyway, let's carry on. So this is a scene where we're introduced to Superman, and we talk about things being symbolic. So the bat and the bat symbol being a certain symbol for something in Gotham City. Well, Superman's symbol also represents something. It's a different kind of heroism, one that's a little bit more, perhaps a little bit more wholesome, a little bit more Clark Kent farm boyish, kind of not as dark or as conflicted as Batman is. So it's a different kind of symbolism. And here, this is in sort of a what-if scenario 10 years into the future, this whole graphic novel. So here, it's assumed that Superman, rather than working on his own, starts to work with the government, the U.S. government. So the symbol of Superman becomes wrapped up, as you see in this really interesting way. It's visually morphed with the American flag. So there you have two very important symbols, one from our real world and one from the fictional universe of Superman. So you can see kind of the importance of symbols just in our real world, how flags can sometimes symbolize a certain something. We're not quite as patriotic about the Canadian flag as the Americans are about theirs. But when you see that maple leaf, sometimes, you feel the stirrings of pride and, or say the maple leaf, if you're a Leafs fan, you see the maple leaf symbol and you get all, up in arms for the Maple Leafs, even though that's kind of a silly thing to do these days. So symbols play an important role in how we view the world. And the American flag has a very problematic and long history that's both heroic and inspiring, but also has a certain amount of darkness to it and shadiness to it. And I think that's kind of what's happening here a little bit. And a little bit later, this is the death of a general, a military general, and interesting that, of course, that he's wrapped up in the American flag. So, if you remember from the poem, the passionate have all the intensity, whereas the best of us lack all conviction. Well, this is kind of like showing how the real world heroes in this universe aren't good enough. So just being a patriotic hero for the American flag, in this case, isn't good enough. So I think it's a very interesting image, and kind of, if you look at the American flag as representing the values of that civilization, which are somewhat reflected, even though we're in a different country, we still follow very closely, what happens in America, very, very closely tied to it. So this kind of represents the symbolic death of that civilization's values, right? In this new world of chaos. It's something that we're always kind of concerned about. So I think this is represented here visually in a very effective way. And also another interesting image. This is a kind of classic Superman. This is him fighting, I believe, fighting the mutants and their tanks. And he's this is kind of reminiscent of the very first appearance of Superman in Action Comics, where he's like lifting a giant car over his head. So it's kind of an homage to Superman's past. And even visually, he's drawn kind of in that old-timey style, as he would have been in the early, late 1930s and early 40s. And the caption here, which is kind of hard to read, it's a little bit blurry, but it says, "We must not remind them that giants walk among them." So he's decided to work with the government, and Batman's also decided to kind of go underground because the common people, the regular people, are just as afraid of them, the heroes, as they are of the villains. They're intimidating, and you'll see this happening in the X-Men films, right? That's what's often played upon, is this, the battle between who's different, even though they're more powerful or have powers that can help humanity, they're misunderstood. So we have kind of an interesting relationship with our heroes. We're, somewhat afraid of them, and somewhat afraid of being them as well. And certainly the gods, in going as far back as Greek mythology, are not always pleasant entities, right? Even the best of them can be, problems for mortal people. So anyway, I think it was just an interesting little scene for a number of different reasons. So I think this was interesting because it shows, we looked at the last, image of Superman as being a little bit more of the classic kind of colorful, old-timey Superman. And now this is a little bit more like the modern Superman. You'll see he's cast in silhouette. So he's very dark, except for the red cape. So it kind of shows how heroes, who previously we thought of as being, just good guys, are now considered to be a threat and criminals, bad guys. And of course, in this, fictional, imagining of 10 years into the future of the Batman universe at that time, this is what's become of heroes. They've become criminals, and then Superman kind of blames Batman for this because Batman's always kind of operated again like by breaking the rules and kind of using kind of criminal methods to achieve good ends, whereas Superman always kind of has done the do-gooder kind of stuff, right? But it also calls into question, the difference between the superheroes and the supervillains, right? And how, again, this is something that is kind of inside all of us, and that's probably what frightens us about beings that are more powerful than we are. And this is, I like this image. This is from, I think, the end of the third part, or the third book. And this is Batman's final confrontation with the Joker in a cave, appropriately enough. So kind of in kind of where Batman might feel most comfortable. And what the Joker's done is basically snapped his own neck to make it look like Batman did it, right? So again, putting the difficult choice in Batman's hands, or kind of implicating him in the breaking of pretty much his only one rule, not to kill anybody. So it kind of puts Batman in a bit of a morally difficult situation here. And of course the text kind of reflects the coming darkness, right? The sirens echo through the tunnel, tires screech, the world is growing dark. And soon the world is going to be coming for Batman, because they're going to consider him to be a villain now, even more so. So he's falling even further and deeper into the darkness. And I think also just visually, you may or may not have noticed this, but the line work, especially here and in other parts of the graphic novel, is very kind of rough and loose and a bit sketchy. We're used to seeing sort of, especially the older cartoons and comics, as having a very solid and clear line, that very kind of smooth, cartoony look. But I think the kind of the rough and gritty look here is a little bit more realistic, and also suggests something that's more darker and twisted and unstable. So I think the very line work is kind of reflecting what's happening in the scene and what's happening in the world. So anyway, I think that's a really strong image. Another strong image. This is quite literally the Dark Knight. Knights ride horses, right? And so this is Batman riding a badass horse, and appropriately a black one, right? So he's quite literally a Dark Knight. And of course, as the horse is rearing up, it also makes him look like the knight on a chessboard, the Black Knight, of course. And I showed you that really interesting graphic of the Joker playing with the chess pieces. So I think this is a really cool image that kind of symbolizes and mythologizes the character, right, of the Dark Knight. And also, I think this is an image that really only would work in this kind of medium. It wouldn't work in a film, I don't think. First of all, it'd be problematic in a live-action film to have horses involved. And also, in a film, it would probably look a little too silly. Whereas there's something about it in this form and in this medium where it actually looks, I think, pretty cool, and I think we can buy it a lot more than we would in a film. So anyway, just I thought another interesting image. And this is the fight that Superman and Batman have, and interesting that it's tinged green, right, to kind of represent, I think, the kryptonite, and even Superman being weakened at this point, and the fact that they've fallen so far that Superman, is just a political liability, as he says, and Batman is Batman is saying he's a political liability and calling Superman a joke, and how they've kind of failed to change the world, right? And now they're fighting each other. So kind of again the heroes, falling and having this epic confrontation with each other. And I like this one as well. This is Superman basically detonating the nuclear weapon that's been fired in the story. And he's Superman, so he can withstand it, but it still does some serious damage. and you can see how messed up he is. And the visuals here are just like utter flame and again chaos. This is what we're afraid of with nuclear holocaust, like the world just going up in flames, and also something hellish about it, right? So something representing the devil or darkness, and in this scene, Superman is also kind of reborn. He comes back, like he kind of goes from being, kind of nearly melted or crumbled, and he comes out of that reborn and renewed, just as the world will soon be. And then, of course, Batman, at the very end, like I said, he's presumed to be dead. Superman figures it out. He knows he's not dead because he can hear his heartbeat in the coffin. And this is the very last panel. So this is Batman underground with who are now the reformed mutants. Because remember, he's kind of defeated the main mutant and won the other mutants over to his side, because they're all kind of just young kids that are confused and need guidance. So he's here to show them the way. And again, visually, you see that it's a spot of light in the darkness. So a symbol again of hope. And at the center, of course, is Robin in her colorful costume, and now the mutants who before their visors were a little kind of scary. Now the colors look softer and more hopeful, right? Their costumes are kind of lighter pastel colors, and the red visors don't look as intimidating. They just look like bright spots of color. So hope for the future, and also, again, Bruce Wayne being master of two worlds now. He's kind of alive and dead. He's both above ground and underground. So I think it's an appropriate way to end the story, and also an appropriate way to end this somewhat lengthy lecture that's been going on and been rambling on. So thanks for bearing with me, and I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed Batman. And your next step is to watch one of the films. Again, your choice. You can watch The Dark Knight by Christopher Nolan with Christian Bale and Heath Ledger, or any of those Batman films. You can also watch one of the Tim Burton films, or if you really want to, you can even watch one of the Joel Schumacher films, which were terrible, from the 90s with George Clooney and Chris O'Donnell. Or if you really want to, you can also go back and watch Batman from the 60s, maybe find a couple episodes somehow and watch those. But watch some kind of adaptation that's on screen, and then compare your experience of that to what you found in the graphic novel. So that's it. Goodbye, and have fun.